In the early 1940s, the Soviet Union had one of the largest gold reserves in the world, over 2,500 tons of pure gold. That's about 180,000 gold bars. The real amount of gold could be even higher than the official amount. Some of the bars were not on the balance sheet, as they were stored in closed special vaults of the KGB and the Ministry of Defense. In those times, money could depreciate overnight, but gold always remained in value. It provided economic stability, the ability to trade with other countries, and influence world politics. The USSR, especially during Stalin's reign, did not trust Western banks and currencies. Gold became its silent weapon. For example, during international transactions, when dollars and pounds sterling could be sanctioned or blocked, gold was always accepted. It was a universal way to pay for grain, factory technology, and even weapons. The gold reserve was also needed for emergencies. For example, if a war or economic crisis broke out, gold could be used to buy everything needed abroad, from bread to tanks. The USSR understood this and therefore constantly replenished the vaults. When we talk about thousands of tons of gold, the question immediately arises: where was it all stored and who had access to it? After all, this is not just a bunch of precious ingots. It is a state secret for which you could get under the article. In the USSR, the approach to storing gold was not just strict, but as classified and protected as possible. Officially, part of the gold was in the state bank, but the main reserves were not kept there at all. Gold was stored in military bunkers, mines, and underground vaults that could withstand even a nuclear strike. These bunkers were built in the strictest secrecy. The workers signed non-disclosure documents, they were monitored by the authorities, and all drawings were destroyed after construction was completed. The reason for this secrecy was the threat of war with the West. The Soviet leadership seriously feared a nuclear strike and prepared for the worst. Therefore, the storage facilities were equipped with special protection against a nuclear explosion. Thick concrete walls, airtight doors, ventilation systems. Everything was designed to survive even in the event of a global catastrophe. It is important to understand, the gold was not stored in one place. It was scattered in different parts of the country, so that in the event of war or sabotage, it would not be lost all at once. It was a system designed for the survival of the state in any conditions. The USSR treated its gold not as wealth, but as a strategic resource in case of the end of the world. It was protected in a way that even nuclear missiles were not. Some vaults were so classified that even after the collapse of the USSR, information about them never surfaced. It is still unknown whether they were sealed, looted, or continue to store the remnants of the gold reserve. But even the most reliable vaults could not guarantee safety in the conditions of a real war. When, in 1941, the German offensive on Moscow began, it became clear: gold must be urgently saved. After all, if it fell into enemy hands, it would not just be a blow to the economy, it would be a collapse of confidence in the Soviet government. A secret operation was launched to evacuate the gold reserve. Without unnecessary noise, under heavy security, at night from Moscow vaults, gold was loaded on special trains and taken to Kazan, deep into the country, away from the front. The operation was carried out in panic and haste. People in Moscow were digging trenches, preparing for defense, and at the same time trains with gold bars were moving along the railway under heavy guard. No one, except for a narrow circle of military and NKVD employees, did not know what was being transported. There is a version that some of the gold bars never reached Kazan. The boxes disappeared from the train, and it was noticed on the spot. What happened on the way is unknown. Perhaps a robbery, perhaps an internal operation. There's no paperwork or investigation. The problem is that in those years, any loss of this magnitude was classified as secret. And even if there were witnesses, it was dangerous to talk about it out loud. It could be regarded as a betrayal. In addition, at the same time, there was an active movement of gold at the international level. The USSR, using part of the stockpile, bought weapons, equipment, and materials abroad. Hundreds of tons were shipped across the Arctic and Atlantic on foreign ships. It was an operation of high secrecy. The routes were kept secret, the cargoes were guarded, and the documents were labeled of special importance. But not everything went according to plan. In May 1942, the British cruiser Edinburgh carried 40 tons of Soviet gold in payment for equipment. On the way back, the ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Part of the crew was killed, and all the gold went to the bottom of the Barents Sea. This story was classified for decades. The loading took place in Murmansk. NKVD soldiers accompanied the boxes with gold bars, carefully checked the weight, sealed each box. Everyone knew the loss of even one ingot would be court-martialed. And yet there were losses, and the ship went to the bottom. The gold was recovered only 45 years later, in the late 80s, and not all of it. It's still unknown where some of the gold bars went. Evacuation of gold saved the economy of the USSR, but also created conditions for the first losses, for which no one was responsible. Undercover military transports in 1941 laid the groundwork for future gold disappearances in peacetime, when everything happened ostensibly according to the same well-established schemes. For example, to pay for the equipment of factories, for the purchase of technology, and even for payment for the services of Western specialists. Some historians claim that under the guise of Lend-Lease, the USSR paid in gold for much more than officially declared. It would seem that after the victory and the restoration of the country, the gold reserve should have been growing. The economy was working, industry was developing, exports were profitable. But everything happened on the contrary. By the end of the 80s, in the documents began to appear alarming figures. The gold reserve of the USSR was rapidly declining, and there were almost no explanations for this. Reports were vague and data were incomplete. The closer was the collapse of the USSR, the more questions arose about the country's gold reserve. According to official data, in the early 80s, the Soviet Union had about 2,000 tons of gold. But by 1991, this figure had already decreased almost fourfold. Where the gold went, there was no answer. People knew nothing about it, and on television they only talked about deficits and reforms. Against the background of growing problems in the economy, the decline in production, and empty counters, the authorities began to secretly use gold as the last reserve. But this was done in closed mode, without transparent reporting. Some of the gold was sold abroad, ostensibly to buy food, medicines, and equipment. However, specific amounts and volumes of transactions were not published anywhere. Most of the information is still classified. Only one thing is known. During the perestroika years, an active outflow of gold out of the country began. Some historians argue that it was during these last months of the USSR that gold began to be used as a personal resource of a narrow group of leaders rather than as a state asset. There were reports that some of the bullion simply disappeared, without a trace, without explanation, without reports. Under the guise of the struggle for the survival of the USSR, there was a quiet redistribution of strategic resources, and gold was one of the first assets that went into the shadows. And now, the main question: who exactly controlled access to gold during this period? Who signed the export documents? And why did all traces of these operations disappear in the 90s? In the Soviet Union, the system was organized in such a way that literally only a few people had access to the country's gold reserves. These were not just officials, but representatives of the highest level. The chairman of the Council of Ministers, the leadership of the State Bank, and of course the KGB and the Ministry of Defense. Ordinary employees of even large financial institutions did not know where exactly the gold reserves were kept. The vaults were under dual control, civilian and military. Any movement of gold, even for 1 bar, had to go through the signatures of several high-ranking officials. All information about it was classified as top secret. But towards the end of the 80s, things started to change. Control loosened. The country was in chaos, and it was at this point that gold started to go abroad. The strangest thing is that after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, key documents that showed the routes, recipients, and even volumes of these movements disappeared. The archives either burned down or were lost. Who did it and why is still unknown. The most disturbing thing is that none of the high-ranking participants in these processes was held responsible. Everything was written off to the difficult political situation. Hundreds of tons of gold are disappearing, and no one can say exactly where they are. It seems that we have technologies, international banks, archives, special services, entire commissions. But for more than 30 years, no one can give a clear answer as to what happened to the USSR gold reserve. One of the main reasons is that the archives are still classified. All documents that could show when, where, and who exported the gold are classified as secret. Some are in military vaults, others in the archives of the former KGB. Access to them is closed even for researchers. And without documents, neither investigations nor official claims are possible. There is another problem. International banks where the gold was withdrawn to are not obliged to disclose data on closed accounts. If the gold is registered to individuals or offshore companies, it is virtually impossible to recover it without accurate evidence. And there is no proof, because there is no access to the archives. The secrecy surrounding the archives is a major barrier. As long as they are closed, even the most obvious traces of disappeared gold will remain invisible to the law and society. When the USSR collapsed, of the thousands of tons that were stored in vaults across the country, Russia officially inherited only about 300 tons. This is the data of the central bank of the early 1990s. But where is the rest? According to calculations, the gold reserve of the USSR had at least 1,000 tons in the last years of the country's existence, and more than 700 tons are still listed as lost without explanation. There is no exact data on where they are, when they were taken out, and in whose name they are registered. They're just missing. This means that more than 70% of the country's strategic gold has disappeared without a trace, and no one has been held responsible for it. There are no investigations, no court cases, no international inquiries. Everything was written off as a transition period. The remaining 300 tons became the basis of the gold reserve of the new Russia. This volume was officially registered, and they began to work with it within the framework of the new financial system. Everything else, as if it never existed. There are still no answers. What do you think about it? Write in the comments.